Today on Yeti at Large, presidential leapfrog with a surveyor, a sheriff, a general, and an apprentice. So a couple of days ago, it was George Washington's birthday. And a tradition that's taken place every year since 1896 took place again. And they read his farewell address on the floor of the Senate. The distinguished senator from the great state of Oklahoma had the privilege of reading it. First time somebody from Oklahoma. Oh, hi there, kiddo. Hi there, kiddo. Yeah, good girl. Good girl. Yes, you are. And it struck me as interesting because of the coincidence of me receiving a small lapel pin from my father's Etsy shop commemorating the inauguration of Grant's tomb in 1897, just a year later. Really got me thinking about the spirit of George Washington's leadership example, the political climate at that time. We had to come inside because the wind started howling and the swirling snow made it impossible to film. I'm going to play a very, very small segment of the entire speech, but please go back and read the whole thing and try to understand it. It is incredible, the clear portrait of the concept of what the Constitution and how the federal government was supposed to function from hundreds of years ago. It rings as true today as the day that Washington penned those words.
However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer to popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretext. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution alterations which will impair the energy of the system and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown.
And like they said, for a general at that time in history to lay down his sword, give up his power, and return to private life, cast a die for the American example of the peaceful transference of power. Nobody had ever done it up until that point. So it made me wonder, and I wanted to look downrange to see the next president that I could find that truly embodied many of those principles that Washington laid down. I exempted myself from his contemporaries such as Jefferson and Adams, and I went downrange where there was a little bit of separation. The next president that I found playing leapfrog was Grover Cleveland, the sheriff. Grover Cleveland's an interesting example of the late 1800s. One of my favorite examples of the fiscal conservatism that he consistently demonstrated was as the elected sheriff of Erie County in New York. It was his responsibility to execute condemned prisoners, of which he did twice. He had the option of performing the task himself for free or paying a deputy $10 to do that. He didn't think it would be prudent to pay $10 and when he could do it himself for free, and he was required to by law. He didn't relish in the task, but like I said, he did it twice because that was the example of fiscal conservatism. Grover Cleveland was elected the 22nd president and immediately threw a wrench in the status quo. There was a concept known as the spoils system back then, that when you were elected to an office, you fired everybody and brought all your own people and installed them. A lot of times that would go straight down party lines, but it wouldn't exclude donors, contributions, and other supporters and volunteers. Cleveland didn't embrace the spoils system. He said he wasn't going to fire any Republicans if they were doing a good job. History has played out that that was quite a bipartisan act on his behalf. He took a lot of heat from his own party, and he was widely criticized at the time. He was so fiscally conservative that he wouldn't award pensions to Civil War veterans under dubious claims because he could find no law under the United States Constitution that required or empowered him to do so. Quite impressive. Interestingly enough, he's the only president to serve 2 terms non-sequentially. He lost his next election bid, in large part with the lack of support from his own party, so he wasn't the 23rd president, but as poorly run as the 23rd presidency was, he was renominated and was elected again to be the 24th president. He oversaw currency issues where he maintained a gold standard. He oversaw strikes where he maintained the limits of the federal government, and that was not popular as he was in a very tax and spend environment. So his contemporaries widely panned him, and he left office with very low marks, a very low approval rating, if you will. History has reversed that and played him out to be a very good leader, a sound fiscal conservative, and a good president. So to date, there has been no other non-consecutive presidency in the United States, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Leaving Grover Cleveland and leapfrogging forward, I went to look for the next president that I could find that really demonstrated the limits of federal power, and I found it in Dwight D. Eisenhower. And since we're playing leapfrog, think of the technological leapfrog forward from propeller-driven airplanes to jet power. This example of a NASA F-104G starfighter is on loan to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona. It's going to be our backdrop today to talk about President Eisenhower. It was decommissioned officially in 1990, and it's listed as being in good condition. These 104G models were built a little bit later than some of the early starfighters. This NASA model, November 811, November Alpha, I believe went as high as 103,000 feet and well in excess of Mach 2.5. Some of these models were even fitted with hydrogen peroxide attitude control jets for high altitude research. Pretty cool stuff. I believe these were known for some pretty vicious uncoupling characteristics, yaw and roll uncoupling, and those attitude recovery jets at high altitude paved the way for flights for the X-15 and other assorted ones. What I think is interesting is when you look at this particular jet, you can see in its bones that if you take this wing off and bolt on what's the equivalent of a glider wing, and you take that high T-tail and mount it just a touch lower, change the inlets, and you have a U-2 spy plane. If you look carefully, you can see Bernoulli's law in effect with the narrowing of the fuselage. It's kind of humbling and sad to see these things sitting here stationary on the ground. So if we're going to play leapfrog with the presidents, from Grover Cleveland to Dwight Eisenhower, I like using this 104 starfighter, the missile with a man in it, the Widowmaker. I like using that as a prop. It was on the drawing boards about the time he was campaigning for his first term, and it stayed in active service up until almost the same date as his death in 1969. It represents the advancements in aviation and aerial combat. This wasn't much of a dogfighter, as you can tell by those low aspect ratio wings, but she could sure shoot and scoot as an interceptor. Dwight Eisenhower, in a very underrated speech at the time, warned us about the rise of undue influence from universities, laboratories, and military-industrial complex. The speech went largely unnoticed at the time, but it turns out to be a seminal moment in American history today through history's filter.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. so is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Not all of Eisenhower's foreign policy decisions hold up through history's filter, but they were consistent with the Monroe Doctrine and some of the international edicts at the time. We were in the midst of the Cold War, and Eisenhower warned us about the undue rise of influence through the military-industrial complex. And one of Eisenhower's lesser-known speeches is about a chance for peace, and what it was about was the true cost of war and the true cost of the arms industry. This clip here tells an awful lot.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people.
One of my favorite moments in Eisenhower's life, though, is right after World War II. Somebody first asked him about his interest in running for public office. Eisenhower stated that outside of an extremely compelling reason, military men had no business running for public office, from anywhere starting at dog catcher up to grand supreme leader of the universe. How unconventional of Eisenhower to warn everybody of the rise of undue influence and power from the industrial military complex and the scientific academia community. This was America's general, won World War II. So based on that, I went looking for the next leapfrog with the most unconventional president I could find that still embodied those principles of George Washington. Leapfrog forward to number 45, Donald J. Trump. Now, I'm not going to invest in the controversies, the fad language, the mudslinging. I don't care about any of that. History bears a far different lens for the president's performance than his contemporaries or her contemporaries. But I will look directly at the inaugural speech where the president said that power was being returned to its rightful owner, you, the American public, we the people.
Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning, because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the people. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. That all changes starting right here and right now.
And every step along the way, deregulation, smaller tax, more income, larger industrial base, bore that out. This was a guy, for the first time in the history of Air Force One, going back to Dwight Eisenhower, that he negotiated to cut costs on a new Air Force One. And he bought used planes. I think that that's fascinating. History will bear out, regardless of what happens with this next coming presidential election in 2024, that this was a person who shrunk the size of the federal government and did everything he could to return the authority and the power to its rightful owner, the American people. People of every walk, every origin, every ambition. Why I think Grover Cleveland is interesting and relates to Donald Trump is that Trump stands to be the next person who could be the second non-sequential president, being 45 and then 47. So this has been Presidential Leapfrog. From a surveyor to a sheriff to a general to an apprentice. It might be unconventional, but I really implore you to look at some of the history of these individuals and look how they sought to limit federal power, to shrink that umbrella, to stay within the scope of the lawful responsibility, not to expand relentlessly. One of my favorite quotes of all time was from Dr. Franklin when he emerged from Independence Hall and somebody in the crowd shouted, "What kind of government have you given us?" And he looked at him and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." My final word on this is one of my childhood heroes, somebody I still admire to this day, Nelson Vales, Olympic track cyclist. Talk about unconventional. Talk about power and speed. If you don't know who Nelson Vales is, I strongly recommend that you look him up and learn his story. He inspired me in the early 80s, and he'd inspire you too. Thank you so much for joining us here at Yeti at Large.